Hello and welcome everyone to the Unb Law podcast. My name is Michael Marin and I'm the Acting Dean of Law at UNB. We begin all of our events by recognizing and respectfully acknowledging that the UNB Law community gathers on the unsurrendered and unceded traditional lands of Wolastoqey. Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Vaughn MacLellan, a graduate of the class of 1995. Mr. MacLellan is a partner in the Toronto office of DLA Piper, a global law firm active in over 40 countries. His practice focuses on corporate and securities matters with an emphasis on corporate finance and mergers and acquisitions. Mr. MacLellan is very involved in a number of industry organizations, including serving as director of the Association for Corporate Growth, Toronto chapter. He also served on advisory committees of the TSX Venture Exchange and the Ontario Securities Commission. Mr. MacLellan also has an interest in public policy and serves on the board of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a national nonpartisan think tank. Mr. MacLellan is a recognized leader in his field by several professional publications, including in Canada, Canadian Legal Expert Directory, and the Legal 500. Mr. MacLellan has also been a devoted supporter of our faculty. For several years, he commuted from Toronto to Fredericton each week to teach corporate transactions. And he and his wife also established the MacLellan Family Scholarship to support law students who are active in the community. Vaughn, thank you so much for joining us on the UNB Law podcast. It's a real treat to have you here.
Mike, it's a great pleasure for the faculty, outreaching with alumni, letting us know a little bit about what's going on at the school and making sure that we're staying engaged, because I think it's an exciting time right now for the law school. And so thank you very much for the invitation.
Well, that's exactly the point of the podcast, right? We're trying to make the best of the pandemic, which is awkward for UNB Law because we're known as such a close community. But now the pandemic has separated us. And so we're trying to recreate that feeling. And one of the ways that we're trying to do that is using this as an opportunity to reconnect with our alumni, make people feel part of the law school again, and inspire our students at a time when maybe they're feeling a little bit anxious. So it's wonderful to have you part of this project. So I typically start these discussions by asking our guests a little bit about their life before law school. So can you tell us where you're from and a little bit about your upbringing?
Sure. Well, look, I'm a very proud Maritimer. I'm from Moncton, and I was born in Moncton and grew up in Moncton. I actually grew up in the exact same house for the whole time I was in Moncton. My parents moved into that house the year I was born, in fact, the month I was born. And my dad passed away many years ago, but my mother is 91, still going strong and still living in the house. So wow. It's interesting that I've had that connection to the house and connection to the community all my life. I've come from a family of 4 children, and my father was a doctor in Moncton, an orthopedic surgeon. My mother was a nurse. And I have to say that, growing up in Moncton in the 70s and 80s was a fairly idyllic upbringing, or at least it seems that way in retrospect, but that might be a bit of nostalgia on my part. But I would say it was, a special time and a special place to grow up when you think about, living here in Toronto now in particular, kind of kids and what it's like to grow up and be out in the community. It was just a completely different day and age. And I think that, that was really a wonderful community to grow up in, and lots of great music in the 80s as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't mean to jump ahead, but I also don't want to forget this. So you obviously have such a fondness for your hometown. And you still have family there, but you have such a busy career in Toronto. Are you able to get back often? How do you maintain that connection? Or are you able to?
Yeah, well, we do try. So my wife is from Halifax, and we try to get back to the Maritimes as often as possible. We built a cottage in Prince Edward Island, so that is sort of neutral territory between our Moncton family and our Halifax family. So, what we tended to do, and this is all, of course, kind of pre-COVID, which has put a bit of a hinge in travel plans, but basically we try to get back as often as possible. We would typically be home for Christmas every year. That's not going to happen this year. I wouldn't expect. We would typically be home. The last few years we've gone home to Moncton during Family Day weekend in the winter to visit with my mother. We are usually at the cottage and getting it opened Victoria Day weekend in May, and then we're closing it down with family at Thanksgiving. And we spend quite a bit of time there as much as possible through the summer. So we really visit with family a lot in all the cities, but particularly at the cottage, and a lot of friends too. There are a number of good friends from Unb Law School who are in PEI, and I see them quite often when we're on the island. And I have some business interests in Moncton as well. So I'm involved in some real estate development there, and we're building some apartments and a couple of other buildings at the moment. So I do try to get down there often on business as well. Again, that's all kind of pre-COVID, but anyway,
Yeah.
we'll be back to normal, hopefully sometime next year.
That's so great to hear, because I think a lot of students from Atlantic Canada, struggle with that. I think everyone struggles with that when you leave. I mean, I'm from Montreal. I grew up in the same home my whole time there, and it was only 2 years ago that we moved my mom out of that. She's 80 now, and she moved with us here to Fredericton a couple years ago. And so that's just always a challenge for anyone. You have such an attachment to your hometown, and it's just nice to hear that you can have a wonderful career, and still maintain those links and come back. I think that'll be reassuring for a lot of our students.
Yeah, well, look, that happens a lot. Look, I think people talk about that attachment being very strong for Maritimers, but as you point out, it's certainly the same case if you're coming from Montreal or wherever you're coming from. If you're living somewhere else, you carry that. But I do think Maritimers carry a very strong attachment and affinity for the Maritimes, and you can be anywhere. I've got to tell you, when I used to commute back to Prince Edward Island in the summer, when I would fly down, my wife and daughter would typically be down at the cottage for most of the summer, and I would fly back and forth, and the plane coming from Toronto and going back to Toronto over the weekends was usually full with people who were traveling back and forth. And so, lots of people are doing that. You don't lose the connection just because you're living somewhere else.
That's fantastic. That's great. So can you tell us a little bit about what you did before coming to law school? In particular, where did you do your undergraduate studies, and what did you choose to study at that time?
Sure. So I did my undergrad at Dalhousie, and I did a Bachelor of Commerce degree. So I was there for 4 years and did a bit of a minor in finance, a major in finance, and then some minors as well in political science and economics. Had a great time at Dal. It was, going from, it's funny how, and we'll talk about this a little bit as we go through this, but, when you go through all of this and start thinking back over your life, I remember the move going from Moncton to Halifax and thinking that I'd kind of, moved from this small little town to the big city. And then now in retrospect, you look back and think about really how small Halifax is even. But right. I remember it was an exciting period of time going from Moncton to Halifax. I had gone there with a best friend of mine from high school who was my roommate first year in residence at Dal. And, I would say the first couple of years, I probably should have taken it a little bit more seriously. But I did find one thing about Dal as well, was that, the class sizes were pretty large the first couple of years. And I found it took a bit of time to get into the groove of things and really connecting with faculty. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit later, just about some of the things that make UNB special. But it was a big university. I enjoyed it. I had some great professors, but I think it really took a couple of years. And I would say it was the last 2 years that really made, much more difference in terms of my education there than the first 2 years. But it was a great time, made lots of friends, and Halifax is a wonderful community as well.
Well, that's great. Yeah, I love Halifax. My wife loves Halifax, and we try to spend a little bit of time there. We still have friends in the city. Was law school always in the cards for you? Is that something that you contemplated for a long time, or did you realize it later on? When did you realize you wanted to go to law school?
Well, it's kind of a circuitous route, and I would say it was in the back probably since high school. I went and did a kind of a work placement experience for a week at the office of a lawyer, Peter Wright, who's now with Cox and Palmer and counsel at Cox and Palmer in Moncton. And he was the husband of Janet Wright, who was my grade 10 homeroom and French teacher. And I ended up going over to do the work experience with him. And I knew a little bit about law. I'd had family friends who were lawyers and didn't really know exactly what it meant to be a lawyer, but I went and worked in his office for a week and had a little bit of insight into that. It was mainly a corporate commercial practice. So I'd always been thinking a little bit about it, kind of in the back of my mind through high school. Popular media kind of had an influence as well when you're watching different shows, kind of growing up, LA Law and things like that, that makes you think about, oh, well, is law this exciting? It was kind of there. And then when I went to Dal, was really when I started thinking about it more fully, because as I was getting through my undergrad, I started thinking, well, what am I going to do now? And it wasn't, a thing where I'd always had a drive to go to law school, but I thought, that law was really probably the best approach for me, or best path. As we were getting into upper years in undergrad, there was a lot of recruitment starting to go on, and you were starting to have to try to find a career path. At Dal and in the commerce program, there was a lot of effort by accounting firms to try to recruit people. I was in the mix a little bit in that, but really ultimately determined that I didn't want to be an accountant. And then it kind of took some turns, because what happened in my fourth year, I'd been involved in student politics a little bit at Dal, and I was appointed to be the chair of the Dal Student Union for the following year.
Oh,
and wow. So my plan was, I was going to graduate, finish my undergrad, finish my BCom, and then I was going to go back. Question, of course, was, okay, well, what am I going to go back for? And so I decided to apply for law school. Well, as it turned out, I didn't get in. So, okay. Best laid plans don't always work out. But then what happened in the meantime, I'd been working at ACOA, the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency in Moncton, for the summer during my third year. And then after I finished my fourth year as well, and I graduated. And I really enjoyed the experience there, but I got to know a guy by the name of Michael McDonald, who was a professor at Mount Allison and involved in the founding of ACOA.
Wow.
And so, I kind of was speaking to Michael one day about what was going on in my situation. I hadn't gotten into law school. I was thinking, okay, well, I'll go and do, something else for a year, and then serve as the chair of the Dal Student Union, and then take it from there. And Michael then gave me a job offer. And he said, well, look, I think, you should take some time, stay here, work with me. And he was putting together a team at that point in time, which was working on something called the New Trader Initiative. And we'll talk a little bit about this as well. But the focus at ACOA at that time was very much on entrepreneurship, and also about trying to make Atlantic Canadians more outward looking and focused on trade. And so I found that very interesting. I thought it was a good opportunity. And so he made that offer, and I ended up staying there and working with him. Sorry, I'm just a little dry. I'm going to have to drink water.
Sure.
So I ended up staying there and working with Michael, and it proved to be a great experience. I was there only for a year, but I worked with him, and there were two other individuals, a guy named Colin Rainey, who had just graduated from the School of Government at Harvard and was doing some work at ACOA, and David Cook, who was over in PEI, and all three of them proved to be great mentors. And, I'd not really had mentors before that point in time. And so I found it really made a big difference having them and having that experience. So I worked at ACOA for a year, and then that team started to disband a little bit and go separate ways. So I then ended up working for the Atlantic Provinces Chamber of Commerce for another year. And again, I had great mentorship there with an individual by the name of Paul Daigle. And when I was doing those jobs, it was great because it gave me a great perspective on economic development, gave me a great perspective on the region. When I was doing the work at ACOA, I ended up going to Boston, New York, and some other centers on the Traders Initiative. And when I was at ACOA, the Atlantic Provinces Chamber of Commerce, I ended up working on an initiative to create what was called the Atlantic Canada Chinese Business Council at the time, to try to improve trade between Atlantic Canada and Asia. And so I ended up going to Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the Shenzhen area of China at the time in 1992 with that group. And so that was all pretty exciting.
Wow.
And then, all of that sort of came to an end. And then I had to decide about the next step and what I was going to do. And as I was at the Atlantic Provinces Chamber of Commerce, I really started giving some thought to to going into law school, because when I was at ACO, I'd been given an opportunity as well to kind of stay in the civil service and maybe have a civil service career, but I knew that I wanted to do more, and again, felt that a law degree would be very beneficial and give me lots of different paths, whether I wanted to be in private practice or in-house or government or business or whatever I wanted to do.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. And then so why UNB Law then? Was it your sort of roots in New Brunswick? Something in particular that you liked about the faculty? Why did you choose to come here?
Well, look, I knew I was going to stay in New Brunswick, but there was again another wrinkle. And so you'll find that my story, I've got lots of wrinkles. And what happened was, more as I get older too, but what had happened was when I was working at the Atlantic Provinces Chamber of Commerce, I decided that I might run for Moncton City Council. You know, I'd always been very interested in politics, and I decided to, and I'd gotten involved in the Liberal Party while I was in Moncton, and we'll talk about that a little bit, because there were some people involved with the Liberal Party at the time who, again, were kind of mentors and had some bearing on the decisions I made. But so I ran for city council, and my grand plan at that point in time was that I was going to be on city council in Moncton, start a political career, and I was going to apply to and go to law school at the University of Moncton and do it in French. Yeah. I lost the election. I lost by about 400 votes, and it was the best thing that I've ever lost in my life, actually, probably now looking back on it. But you know, my life would have been very different if I'd won. And then the second thing is that I had to take a French language test to go to the University of Moncton, and I failed by 2 marks. So having lost the election and having not passed that language test, you know, I'd applied to UNB because that had been sort of my thinking about my backup, that I might go to UNB as well. And so I ended up going to the University of New Brunswick Law School. And I was also influenced in that very much by Jim Lockyer, who, as you know, went to UNB Law. He's an alumni. And he was the Dean of Law at the University of Moncton Law School for a period of time, and a longtime professor there. He was a family friend, and I got to know Jim fairly well, being involved in Liberal Party politics in Moncton while I was working there for those couple of years. And Jim at the time had been elected in Frank McKenna's 1987 sweep and was in Fredericton serving as the Minister of Justice. And I had some talks about things, and I ended up, you know, making the decision to go to UNB and go for it and go to law school. And I ended up living with Jim when I went to Fredericton. So he had a house in Fredericton. It was a great deal because, you know, he would only come to town when he'd have to sort of do business. So he'd come to town kind of Monday through Wednesday or Thursday, and then he'd go home, and I'd have kind of the whole floor of the house to myself. So,
wow, that's an amazing path. And you know, I think what people should take from that is life throws you all kinds of curveballs, right? It's really hard to plan things out. But I'm always amazed, and I've been teaching for about a decade now, and it's amazing how many lawyers and law students try to map out everything precisely. You know, they have a plan in mind, and they feel like if they don't have a plan, then somehow, you know, they're not in control or they're not on top of things. And that's all fine and good, but I think success is actually how you roll with the punches, right? Like how you adapt to things that don't work out, and you have to do it. You have to stay positive, right, and keep moving forward. So I think there's a lot of lessons there in your path to law school. I mean, an election defeat, and you know, lots of opportunities. Mentorship, huge, right? I mean, I think mentorship is a really, really big deal for law students, and you know, a big part of where we're going in the law school is trying to create more opportunities for mentorship. So that was fantastic to hear. And through all that, you made it to UNB Law. So that's fantastic. So let's talk a little bit about your time at UNB Law. So you graduated in '95. What was the faculty like back then? Can you describe how you remember it?
Yeah, look, I would sort of say that it was energetic, it was ambitious, very personable, very supportive. The school was being led at that time by Vaughn MacLellan, who I think just did a fantastic job. He was a fantastic dean. Did a really good job in terms of the orientation of the school and getting people, getting the school out more into the community, kind of getting it out of its silo, getting the school to be more involved in the community, getting people, students and faculty to think more about the community. And I just think, again, that he was a great leader at the time. And he had a great supporting cast, great faculty members. When I look back at my time, I think about people like, Professors Bird, Dorr, Bladen, McAvoy, Townsend, Fleming. There were just, great faculty that some of them had been there a long time. And I think of that list, I'm not sure that anyone is around other than Professor McAvoy, although I'm not sure Professor McAvoy, he just retired. So that's kind of dating me a little bit as well. But just great faculty, and again, very supportive. I think the strength of UNB that has always been talked about is sort of the size of the school, the intimacy with the professors. And when I look back, as I'd mentioned about my experience at Dal with large class size, for me, the large class size, at least in the first couple of years of undergrad, didn't really work. I was a little bit lost with that. As I said, the second couple of, or the last 2 years at Dal were much better when I ended up being in smaller classes and seminars, was able to get to know some of my professors. And there were two in particular who were quite important and good role models and really helped me a lot. But the thing about UNB was you had that with every class. You had that connection automatically with every faculty member. And so, it was a great experience having that, because it was very motivating. And it really enabled you to, they really pushed you. And so I found that it was just, again, there was a lot of energy, there was a lot of ambition, and they were really supportive of students and trying to, help them exceed and try to really lift their, elevate their game.
Oh, that's great to hear. And, I think that character endures to this day. I mean, that is kind of what we're all about in the faculty still. Like we're small in size, and we happen to be in a small city, but that doesn't mean we can't have big goals and we can't achieve big things, right? And that's, I think, a real strength of our faculty. We can do things because of our small size that make amazing accomplishments a reality, and so it's sort of a common theme that I hear from so many of our alumni. And although there's been a lot of renewal in our faculty, we're still very, very committed to that principle. What are some of you've mentioned the mentorship and the connection with the professors. Do you have any sort of fond memories, particular memories from law school that when you and your classmates get together, maybe now these days, you reminisce about?
Oh, well, look, I think there are lots of them. For me, certainly some of the experience in moots was very significant, and I quite enjoyed that. I did the trilateral moot in my second year and the Jessup moot in my third year. The Jessup in particular, McGill hosted that year, so we went off to Montreal and really enjoyed that and had a great experience. I found that the practice course I did with Jeff Bladen was, even though I ended up not becoming a litigator, I really enjoyed that course. He was an exceptional, he really connected well with the students. He, did great things, whether you're going to be a litigator or not, just in terms of presentation and presence. He was just fantastic at teaching that. Professor Bird, I had a great connection with. And, a number of good experiences with him. I remember, there was a grilling once in insurance class that kind of went over the course of, I think, 2 or 3 classes, because I wouldn't sort of concede on a point. that I was unsure about and didn't want to kind of embarrass myself, and I kept kind of getting painted into a corner. And I remember to this day, because it had to do with whether, you know, possession was sufficient to create an insurable interest in and of itself. And so, you know, I was kind of getting painted into a corner by him, and I was embarrassed about whether or not it was right or not. And I wouldn't kind of concede. So I ended up doing a bunch of research, and we'd come back after the next class and he'd say, you know, Mr. MacLellan, are you ready to concede now? And I wasn't. And that kind of went on for a few classes. Anyway, I remember that, you know, that sticks in my mind because the way that he taught the course with the Socratic method and so on was really very interesting, and you know, gave rise to a lot of kind of fun moments like that. I also did a paper with him that I wrote in the third year. And so I had kind of a different experience with him then, because I would go up to his office and sit and have coffee with him for an hour and talk about, you know, we were supposed to be there talking about the paper, but we very often talked about the newspaper and the news and what was going on in business and politics. And, you know, he'd like to educate me about the South Sea bubble and other stock scandals and things like that. So that was, you know, something that really stuck out in my mind, was that experience with him as well. So lots of fond memories, and you know, I've made great friendships. A lot of my closest friends to this day, you know, were made in law school, and we continue to stay in touch. And so it was really just a very great formative time in my life.
You know, it sounds like you really made the most of your time in law school. So you got involved in extracurricular things, or I guess they were curricular, but outside of the classroom, right? So, you know, the Jessup moot and the trilateral moot, and you know, the paper allowed you to build a relationship with an amazing professor, and I'm sure that helped you out as well. And you mentioned student politics in your undergrad, so I happen to be a former student politician as well, and a former Jessuper. And
have you had therapy?
What's that?
Have you had therapy?
It's ongoing. It's ongoing. But actually, in my current role, it's a little bit like student politics. I guess I haven't retired. Now it's university politics, I suppose. But those things are very, very formative. And you know, I hope that in particular students listening will take that to heart. That it's not just all about you know, studying and what happens in the classroom, but you can learn a lot outside of it as well. And there are tons of opportunities at UNB Law like that. I mean, our mooting program, we're really making a big push in our competitive mooting program, because we think that if we can succeed in national moots, that's going to do amazing things for our national reputation. And so we're doing really, really well at the Jessup the last couple of years, made the finals 2 years in a row. And yeah, so it's just great to see that, you know, part of your, you know, even though it was, well, a couple going on a couple decades ago now, but it's still super, super relevant. And hopefully that'll be an example for our students today. So one of the things, though, so it sounds like you made the most of your law school experience, and you probably have no regrets. But I'm wondering if there's anything that you, when you look back on your time in law school, you think, you know, I wish I would have done this differently, or I wish I would have taken advantage of that opportunity. Do you ever think that way, or you know, do you think you really made the most of the experience?
Oh, I think, you know, when I look back on it, I probably made the most of the experience. There might be a couple of things I would maybe look at doing differently, just in terms of courses that I, you know, didn't take, or a few things like that. But by and large, I felt that I got a really good education. I think, you know, it kind of in jest, but courses, I did take constitutional law with John McAvoy in a bit of an experiment where he decided one year that he wanted to teach it in French, and was going to do this in a small seminar setting. So anyway, I you know, had supposedly grown up bilingual in Moncton, but my French was pretty rusty, and I decided I'd take this course with him. And it was fun because there were, I think, only maybe 5 or 6 of us in the class. And so it was a very intimate setting. But I must say that my constitutional law is pretty rusty to this day, because I don't remember too much about constitutional law, learning it in French. But it was, it was a good experience and a great initiative of John's at the time. But by and large, I think, there's probably not a whole lot that I would do differently.
That's fantastic. So let's talk about what happened after law school. You did an LLM at the London School of Economics. That must have been an amazing experience. Can you tell us why you decided to do graduate studies in law and how that's had an influence on your career?
Sure. Well, look, I mentioned Jim Locke here earlier, and that a lot of that goes back to conversations and discussions I had with Jim. Again, Jim was a good mentor, and Jim had gone to the London School of Economics and done an LLM there as well himself. And I interested in the idea of going and getting a bit more legal education just from a different perspective, and maybe being at a different university, different faculty. And so the LLM kind of presented an opportunity to do that. And I really, frankly, wanted to take a year and go try something different and live in London. And so, I really wanted to make that move to go live in the bigger city, to get overseas. I did also look at a couple schools in North America, and my sort of decision making on that had been that if I was going to be an academic, I probably would have gone to one of the schools in North America that I'd looked at. But if I just wanted to do it as an experience and then go on to private practice or do something else, I would go to London. And so I went to London, and that really was such a wonderful experience, just going from my whole trajectory, going from Moncton to Halifax, then back to Moncton to Fredericton, and then all of a sudden going to London. It was just to go to a bigger city like that and to meet the people that I did from all around the world. I ended up living in a residence called London House, which is a trust for overseas students from the Commonwealth in the United States. And my decision to go there was again influenced by Jim, because Jim had lived in London House as well when he was there. And so he told me about it. And, I just met so many incredible people there. And, I kind of regret or look back on it now, because we didn't have sort of, email and social media and everything the way that we did, that we do now. And so staying in touch with a lot of those people kind of really didn't happen, because it wasn't quite as easy. But there are people that I've stayed in touch with. But I just had such a wonderful time living in London. And, I went and sat in on a number of speakers and other courses at London School of Economics. And it was just kind of a great experience.
Oh, that's wonderful. I can imagine. I can imagine. And London is just such a dynamic city, such a diverse city. There's so many opportunities there. So if we fast forward a little bit, you're now known as one of Canada's top corporate lawyers. When did you develop that interest in corporate securities law? Was that something that you discovered while being grilled by Dick Bird at Unb Law, or maybe at LSE? Like, when did you realize that that's where you wanted to take your practice?
Well, thanks for, first of all, on the comment about being one of Canada's top corporate lawyers. I'm not, I know I have some rankings, but I'm not quite sure I'd agree with that. But thank you. But I try my best. But what I'd say in terms of corporate securities law, certainly, my experience with Dick Bird sort of helped that grow a lot on the securities front. I didn't know much about securities law. I didn't know a lot about capital markets. When I was working for the 2 years before I went to law school, which was a great formative experience, because I think that helped me grow a lot in ways around, just in terms of my knowledge about things that I wouldn't have known about if I'd gone straight from undergrad into law school. So that was a really great experience. I got to, be exposed to a lot about entrepreneurship, economic development, business, somewhat kind of discussions around capital raising and capital markets and things like that. So it sort of started then, but I would say that the interest was piqued a lot through discussions with Dick Bird. As I said, when I did my paper with him in the fourth year, we talked a lot about securities regulation. That was the topic of my paper, actually, was on a national securities regulator. And we talked a lot about the history of securities regulation. And so that really kind of piqued my interest at that point in time. So that's when I started to think about corporate and securities law. But, I still wasn't certain whether that's what I would be doing or not. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, maybe kind of on some other stages of
Sure.
this, because, you know, I really didn't know at that time whether I'd maybe be in corporate law or whether I'd be in litigation.
And then you went, so was it after the LLM that you went to Stuart McKelvey in Halifax?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And
So,
so
and what had happened?
Well, then.
Well, and again, you know, when you talk about sort of planning or twists and turns, that wasn't wholly planned either. And I'll give you the background on that. I mean, it all kind of came together when I was doing the trilateral move. It was hosted in Halifax, and there was another UNB Law alumni by the name of David Farrar, who is now on the Court of Appeal in Nova Scotia. David was a young partner, you know, very well thought of, great practice, really ambitious, lots of energy. And he ended up being the judge on one of the panels. And in the social period afterwards, you know, we got chatting, and we didn't talk about Stuart McKelvey. We didn't talk about articling or anything like that, but we knew a lot of mutual people. So David was, you know, older than I was, but he was from New Brunswick. And he knew a number of people I knew from Moncton and other places who'd been at UNB when he was there. And so kind of fast forward, you know, I'd not given a lot of thought to articles or what I was going to do, because my plan again had been to go to London, and then I'd sort of take it from there and see what happened. Because, you know, would I come back to Canada? Would I find something there? I didn't really know what I was going to do. But I ran in, they were doing kind of the OCIs, the on-campus interviews at UNB, and I ran into David, Dave Farrar. He was on campus to do interviews. And he said, "Hey, I didn't see you, you know, you're not coming in for an interview." And I said, "Well, look, you know, it's my situation. I'm going to London. I'm not really sure what I'm doing." And he said, "Well, look, you should come and have an interview." So I went and had an interview with Dave, and Virva Sandstrom was another partner at Stuart McKelvey at the time who was there. So I had that interview, and then the following week, they invited me to go down to Halifax for some additional meetings at the Halifax office. And they gave me an offer to work there for the summer. And so I went and worked for the summer, and I ended up getting an articling offer. And I said, "Well, look, again, I'm not, you know, I'm going to do my master's." So I basically started my articles, I suspended them, and then I went to London, and then I came back and then started working again at Stuart McKelvey to finish my articles. So that was really, a lot of that was because of Dave Farrar.
Wow. So you got to be open. It seems like you have to be open to those opportunities. You know, I mean, you seem like to be a person who is willing to sort of veer off course a little bit and see what opportunities might present. You know, and I think I think that's a really valuable approach. I mean, and in a lot of ways. You know, that's most people's path, but maybe it's not their expectation, right? Like, getting back to what I said earlier, like, the hope is that everything works out neatly, but it rarely does, and you have to embrace these opportunities. So how long were you at Stuart McKelvey for?
So I was there for 2 years. So I did my articles, and I practiced for a year as an associate. And I've got to say, it was a phenomenal experience. You know, the people at Stuart McKelvey, and I was in the Halifax office. It's a fantastic firm. It you know, it's obviously in a smaller region, but they've got some fantastic clients. They act for, you know, some of the biggest companies and entrepreneurs in the region. And I'm kind of coming at that through the corporate lens, obviously, but on the litigation side, they have fantastic litigators as well, and just do some really amazing work. I have the utmost respect for all the people there. And there were some, you know, so I had really good articles at Stuart McKelvey in Halifax. And, you know, Dave Farrar was, again, a great mentor while I was there doing my articles and kind of leading me down a litigation path. And Blois Colpitts, who was another UNB Law alumni, he was at Stuart McKelvey at the time, and sort of involved in securities law. And he kind of got me involved in some corporate and securities matters that really piqued my interest. And Dave, as we got near the close of the articles, you know, I was offered an associate position, and I was supposed to be working with Dave in litigation. And, you know, that was kind of where I started to get, you know, when we talk about plans and having to make decisions and turns, you know, that was one where I really kind of had to give a lot of thought, because I liked working with Dave. You know, it would have been a great experience. But at the end of the day, I just didn't think I wanted to litigate at that point. And I really wanted to focus on business law. So, you know, I had a conversation with them, and they said, "Well, look, to their credit, they said, not a problem, you can stay and go into the corporate group. And so that's what I did. But then I soon decided after that I wanted to make a move to Toronto, and when we can kind of talk about why that came about. But, there were great people. I learned a lot when I was at Stewart McKelvey, and it was just a great experience that laid a foundation for a lot of what I did afterwards.
So let's talk about that now then. So why did you go to Toronto? What drew you there, and where did you end up?
Well, it was kind of an interesting time, late 90s, what was going on in the legal industry with associates. We're kind of at the opposite end of the curve at the moment, but there was a supply shortage and a lot of demand. And so there was a lot of movement of associates. People would leave Halifax and go to Toronto. People who were in Toronto were leaving and going to New York or San Francisco or other places. So there was a lot of movement. I had a number of friends who were leaving the Maritimes and going to, some went to Toronto, some went to Vancouver. One of the classmates a year ahead of us ended up going down to Boston. One of the people that I had articled with at Stewart McKelvey ended up going first to Toronto and then out to Silicon Valley. So, when all that's happening, it starts to make you think a little bit about what's going on in the world around you and whether or not there are opportunities that you might want to look at outside of, of what you're doing. And again, I had a really great time at Stewart McKelvey, great lawyers, great practice. I would have had a fantastic career and time there, I'm sure, with great colleagues. But at the end of the day, I was a little bit restless. And part of it too was, as I mentioned, a number of my friends were leaving. I'd spent a year living in London. And when I came back from London and I was in Halifax, it was sort of like that comment that I made about going from Moncton to Halifax and thinking, oh my gosh, how great Halifax is and how big it is. And then going to London and coming back and having that perspective. So I sort of felt like I wanted to go to a bigger center. And then I guess, the other thing is that kind of pushed it over the edge was I just wanted to focus more on securities law. And despite Stewart McKelvey being the best platform for that in the Maritimes, it was still fairly limiting given the size of the market. And if you wanted to do securities law in Canada, Toronto really was the place to go to do that. So I made the decision to move to Toronto at that point.
So and then where did you land in Toronto, and how did your career progress at that time?
So, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And, maybe it's because of my personality a little bit, when you talk about rolling with things a little bit or, having a plan, but not necessarily sticking to it and being opportunistic. The way that I approached it when I came to Toronto was I looked at it and I said, I knew kind of the kind of law that I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to focus on entrepreneurial law and activity because I didn't want to sort of be in a bigger bureaucratic organization and kind of getting caught in smaller pieces of bigger matters, right? Like I wanted to sort of be more engaged and more involved. So I ended up coming to Toronto through a headhunter. And what I told them was, I said, this is the kind of work I want to do. This is the kind of environment I want. So line me up to meet with a big firm, a medium firm, and a small firm. And so I ended up going to three firms. And the funny thing about it was, so the small firm, which was Wildeboer Delisle, where I ended up going, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But the bigger firm I was at, I went in and had a great interview. And the person who was interviewing me said, asked me where else I was going. And I'm pretty much an open book on those things. I didn't have an issue telling him. So I told him where I was going for the other two interviews. And he said, you're going to Wildeboer Delisle. He said, come on back in here. I want to tell you about these guys because a lot of them are my best friends. So he actually was kind of more effusive in praising about Wildeboer Delisle than he was about the firm where I was interviewing, which was kind of interesting. So I ended up going into Wildeboer Delisle, and that firm had only been around for about 5 years. It was a break off when some people left Stikeman Elliott Corporate Securities Group to form their own firm because they wanted to do the work they were doing in a certain type of environment. They wanted to focus again on entrepreneurs and capital markets and investment bank work, and they're all young and ambitious. So I ended up going in there. It was a very casual environment. They were into casual before casual was kind of a work fad. But at the same time, doing sophisticated work, doing good work, very ambitious about growing and building the firm. And I liked that story because not only could I get to work with clients who were kind of entrepreneurial and focused on growing, but I could do that within a firm that was focused on doing that itself. So I ended up making the decision to go to Wildeboard Lease at that point in time. So I ended up going there in January of '99.
That's so interesting. Yeah, so I started my career in a big city too, in New York, but I was only there for 2 years. And I found it incredibly daunting. Like it just, the thought of having to build a practice in a big city when you're not from there is a really daunting prospect to think about. And you were coming from the East Coast. You arrive in Toronto, at this very sort of entrepreneurial type of firm. How did you go about building your practice and establishing yourself?
Well, look, I didn't worry too much about that, at the stage I was at in my career. And so really, my thought was around the firm and what the firm will do for that. And I was very fortunate because, again, Wildeboard Lease was very entrepreneurial. They were very ambitious. And all of the partners were very good about including young associates in files, helping them to build relationships with clients and to try to build their own book of business and get involved very early on. So, it was really the firm that supported doing that and the partners that supported doing that. When I first arrived, though, again, these are kind of twists and turns, but, throughout my career, there have been lots of ebbs and flows based on what's going on in the capital markets at any particular time. So when I first arrived, it was the dot-com era. And, things were crazy. When we were doing a lot of work for investment banks in particular, that were financing a lot of technology companies, although a lot of the dot-com companies couldn't really be, called technology companies. But we were seeing all kinds of financings every week, so really busy. And through that, got to know a lot of young investment bankers. And so that really kind of helped you to build relationships and to build a practice as things were going on. But it was an interesting time to sort of see what was happening in the markets. And then I'd only been there maybe about 1.5 to 2 years, and all that blew up because the dot-com era,
Right.
ingloriously blew up and disappeared. And so there was a little bit of sitting around playing cards and things like that went on for a little while until, there was some regrouping to see what was going to happen. But then the mining cycle kicked in. And so, for probably the next 8 to 9 years, I was very focused on a lot of work in the mining industry. You go where the work is. And if the capital markets activity is in mining or technology or wherever it is, that's kind of what you end up doing. That event, then, the cannabis industry is really what drove the capital markets for, a number of years out of the last 3-4 years. So there were a lot of ebbs and flows. But at the end of the day, starting it was really because of the environment at Wildeboard Lease that, was enabled you to kind of make connections, get involved in work early on and meet people and focus on building a practice.
Yeah, so you were at Wildeboard Lease for, I guess, 16 years, and then you went to the Toronto office of DLA Piper, which is a global law firm. And I think my understanding is DLA Piper was one of the first international firms in Canada. Was it not? So what sort of made you go in that direction?
Well, again, that wasn't sort of all planned either. DLA, I think Norton Rose. Now, Norton Rose and
That's right.
Are international firms as well. Baker McKenzie.
Yeah.
Baker. So they were around. Baker McKenzie was an international firm that came here and established an office, but it's been more kind of supportive of international work. I think Norton Rose and Denton's are, international firms that arose from mergers of some fairly larger firms here. Norton Rose in particular with Ogilvy Renault, and then Denton's, of course, is the old Fraser Milner firm. So they were around, but DLA was DLA is a very big global business law firm. In my mind, kind of self-serving, but in my mind, on a global level, it's the premier global business law firm. And they were in basically all the G8 or G20 countries other than Canada. They'd been looking around to come to Canada for a number of years. And as part of that, they were looking at a bunch of firms and talking to people. And I ended up kind of falling into their orbit through a headhunter that I knew and had some discussions with them about some ideas of things that could happen, pass. And then about 2 years later, or maybe a year and a half later, I ended up getting a call from this headhunter saying, person X from DLA is in town and wanted to know if you'd like to have dinner next week. So I went along and had dinner. And basically the pitch was, they said, look, we've, decided how we're going to make our entry into Canada. We found a firm that we're going to merge with, which was the Davis LLP firm, which has very prominent in Vancouver, and we've got some Unb Law alumni out there actually with John Landry. And so they were growing east. They had a fairly small presence in Toronto, though, at the time. I think the office in Toronto at the time was about 40 people and a fairly small corporate group. And so the person from DLA said, look, we're going to do this, but we need to focus on the Toronto office and build it. And we've got to focus on building the corporate and security side. And would you be interested in maybe coming over? And, would you have any colleagues, if you had colleagues who might be interested in coming with you, let me know. So I kind of went back, and I had a couple close friends at Wildeboer, and we all enjoyed it there. We had a great time, but we'd all been there for, 15 years. I think one of my colleagues had been there a few years less because he's a little bit younger, but we'd all been there, let's say, a dozen years or more. And again, a great experience, but, there's always some firm politics. There are always, different issues. And there's always a desire, to sit around and think about what other kind of opportunities you have. And I found that the more I kind of dug into DLA and what it was doing, it was very compelling to think about their platform coming to Canada and being involved in that. And the other thing I liked about it too was the idea, and I talked about this with Wildeboer Lease, was their pitch that they're going to grow things here, right? And so getting involved and being involved early on in the growth of DLA in Canada, and in particular in the Toronto office. So some of my, so I ended up eventually going to DLA with three other colleagues from Wildeboer Lease, and one of those, another UNB alumni, not from law, but Kevin Fritz, who taught the corporate transactions course with me at UNB Law for a number of years. We haven't talked about that yet, but we might have an opportunity to do that. And so we ended up going over to DLA, and that office has pretty much doubled in size now in Toronto since we've been there. We've been there just over 5 years, and it's been a fantastic experience. I've worked with clients from the United Kingdom, France, Sweden, Netherlands, China, the United States, and have met a number of fantastic colleagues from around the world. And they're doing things when you get into a bigger organization like that, you see some things that are happening that you just don't get exposure to in the Canadian market. So we have lawyers who are doing stuff in Silicon Valley, who are doing things in New York, who are doing things in London that you don't really get a lot of exposure to. So it wasn't really, it wasn't kind of a move out of Wildeboer Lease so much as a move into DLA. And it was really just very compelling to see that opportunity to try to get a different perspective on practice. And part of it was, sitting down personally and saying, I've been at Wildeboer for 15 years, how much longer do I want to be in the game? And, what are my plans for, say, the next 15, 20 years? And do I want to spend that time here? Do I want to do something different? What kind of opportunities might there be if I go to DLA? What am I going to see there that I'm not seeing here? Am I stale where I am? And am I going to get kind of recharged by going somewhere else? And at the end of the day, it was really being opportunistic, which I've, again, I think I've tried to be a number of times. We talked about that. I think at the end of the day, you've got to keep an open mind and be opportunistic.
And that's certainly one of the themes that's coming through in our conversation. And the other one is you seem like a very ambitious person, right? And you're looking for opportunities, how you can grow, how you can expand your experiences. And what I find interesting about your career is it's not just been about your practice. You're also very interested in economic development. And I didn't know about your background but even before law school in economic development through ACOA. But you're still involved, and you mentioned your interest in property development. So you seem to be very committed to sort of doing things, right, and expanding possibilities, and you're very ambitious that way. And so I want to talk a little bit more about that, because one of the outlets that you have for this ambition of yours and interest in economic development is public policy. We mentioned that in the intro. Why do you think public policy is so important, particularly in the context of economic development and entrepreneurship?
Well, look, I think some of that results from my growing up in Moncton and seeing what was going on in the community there. So, as you may or may not know, Moncton was really a big hub for the CN shops. My grandfather had worked at CN. I had uncles who worked at CN. CN was very prominent in the community, a large employer. And in the 80s, CN closed the Moncton shops, and it was a devastating blow to the city. And, the city responded through a mix of leaders in the business community, government, academia, and social organizations generally to deal with that and overcome that. And it was called, if you look back, there's a lot of discussion about the Moncton Miracle of the 80s. And a lot of that was led because of Frank McKenna coming to government in 87, a focus that he brought to, utilizing some of the strengths that New Brunswick had in telecommunications and bilingual workforce to bring call centers to Moncton, to try to bring jobs back to the community. And if a lot of that hadn't happened, the community would have been very dead. But it got me very interested in thinking about economic development. My time at ACOA in the Atlantic Provinces Chamber of Commerce certainly, built upon that and strengthened that. So I've always been interested in that idea and continue to be very involved in thinking about that for Atlantic Canada. And watching to see what continues to happen in New Brunswick. So I'd always been very thoughtful about, again, economic development and leading into broader discussions about public policy, whether it's education, healthcare, global issues around security, or just all kinds of different things. I just found it always very fascinating. So it was kind of marrying that interest in economic development, business, and interest in politics, and really. Look, at the end of the day, good policy leads to good results, and bad policy leads to bad results. And when you get bad results, it can take an awful long time to overcome them sometimes. So, I think that is very important for good policy. I think that, policy making, the world is becoming much more complex. In the world, when I talk, at the municipal level, provincial level, federal, global, it's all becoming much more complex for a variety of reasons. And so, public policy making is becoming much more complex and is more important than ever. So it just continues to be an interest of mine. And as you know, I'm involved on you mentioned in my initial remarks, I'm involved on the board of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, which is a think tank, public policy think tank in Ottawa, which was founded by Brian Lee Crowley, who has maritime connections as well, in that he had founded the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies. And was involved at Dalhousie University for a number of years before moving to Ottawa to found the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And it's doing some great work on a number of issues of great importance to the country.
Well, let's dig into that a little bit, because in your practice, I'm sure you work with a lot of startup entrepreneurs from all over the world. And according to the Conference Board of Canada, we do really well in what they call entrepreneurial ambition. So we have a lot of interest in starting businesses, but it seems like the snag is the growth part, or translating that into marketable innovation and expansion. And I'm just wondering if you have any reflections. Well, first of all, do you agree with that? And second is, what can be done about that sticking point?
Well, look, I prefaced my remarks by saying that my legal career, my legal work has tended to focus mostly on, industrial issuers, mining clients, resource-based industries, cannabis, so agriculture-based, as opposed to much. I've got some experience with technology companies, but not a significant amount. But I would note when I was at Wildemore, for instance, we took RIM, BlackBerry Public. So, I was very involved in sort of watching that story early on, and that's, a great example of technology industry and story and how important it can be in Canada. So there are lots of other people out there much better qualified than me to speak on it. But I guess, from my own experience and kind of some of the things I've followed and read and looked at, I would sort of say, we don't have and I really kind of look at the Canadian Council of Innovators on this, because John Ruffalo and Jim Bosley and some other people involved in that have great experience and views on this. And, at the end of the day, it all comes down to kind of three things that they note: access to talent, access to capital, and access to customers. We've got lots of talent in this country, amazing amount of talent. We've got capital. There's lots of, we hear very often that there's a capital problem, but there's lots of capital for the right kinds of things at the startup stage. Later stages is where it becomes potentially a problem to take it from a certain stage to another. And you look at some of the things that have happened in Fredericton. There's a great technology scene going on in Fredericton with the stories of Radian 6 and other things like that. And once you get an initial amount of capital into a community, that kind of recycles, right? So you've got the people who sold Radian 6 now investing in other companies. So there's capital out there, particularly at the earlier stages. And then access to customers. And, partly the reality around scaling and things like that is because we're a small country. And, this goes back to my earliest days when I worked at ACOA, thinking about that new traders program I mentioned. That was one of the things I was involved in, is that you need to have an outward orientation. The markets simply are not big enough here, and you can't get sufficient scale to be able to really launch and grow a business the way that you need to. So you've got to be outward looking. We've got to. Now, fortunately, we've got the United States sitting next door, the most dynamic. Well, you can kind of challenge it maybe now a little bit with the growth of China, but dynamic, largest sort of economy in the world, and it's a bit of a blessing and a curse, because what happens with that is we bleed talent to the United States. We're starting to see some of that reverse because technology giants are kind of looking at it and saying, hey, markets like Toronto and Montreal and Ottawa are all great markets. We've got great talent there. So instead of bringing them to the United States, we're going to come to them in Canada. So that's turning around a little bit, but basically we do bleed some talent. We probably bleed some capital, because capital will chase where the highest returns are, where they think the best prospects are. And so, that some of that will go to US companies rather than Canadian companies. And then obviously customers, but the customers, it's on us to then go to the United States. So again, I don't think it's necessarily a startup problem. It's a scale-up problem, and that really is, the government does have a role to play in that, because it is about innovation, and it is about sort of smart policy and decision making by government. Because we've gone, look, in the history of Canada, there's lots of innovation, whether it's in transportation corridors, railways, canals, communications infrastructure, all those kinds of things. We've got a history of innovation. What we're grappling with, I think, over the last 3 decades is innovation in data and intellectual property. I mean, that's where everything is now these days. That's kind of the next wave of the economy, is really dealing with data and intellectual property. And that's where huge amounts of capital and power and everything else are going. And that has implications for business. It has implications, even for the nation, right, in terms of national security and things like that. But from a economic perspective, we've got to find strategies for the government to support that. And COVID is kind of an interesting time for that, because we'll see what happens with a lot of this initiative around Build Back Better and climate change. I haven't mentioned climate change, but that's part of it too. There are lots of things government can do to help support that. But my whole perspective on public policy and innovation is that government can't mandate it. Government doesn't create it. It's got to support and be led by the private sector. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. So government has to kind of listen to some of these experts, like the Canadian Council on Innovation, and focus on trying to get some policies in place that are going to make that happen.
It's interesting because I explored some of these themes in an earlier episode of the podcast with Wade MacLellan. And
Okay.
during his time as premier, PEI had significant economic growth. And I asked him how he did that. And one of the things he said that his government did is really promote the business strengths and advantages of PEI, even to the point of promoting like particular sectors, right, that had certain structural advantages, right, advantages that maybe an investor couldn't get anywhere else. I'm kind of reading in a little bit to what he said, but that's the sense that I got, is that a smaller place, a smaller market needs to focus on what its strengths are, where its competitive advantage is. And then maybe there's a role for government to promote those advantages internationally. Do you agree with that approach?
I do, absolutely. And I think, I'll go back to, the Moncton Miracle and sort of what was happening in New Brunswick after Frank McKenna came to power in 87. If you look at what he did, he really focused again on, what were the strengths of New Brunswick to be able to bring business or support business growth in the province. It was really around telecommunications. We had a very strong fiber network that had been put in place by It was kind of real world-class leading at the time. And we have a very strong bilingual workforce. So, and then he went out and utilized those strengths in addition to people, because, he had a business community, he had academia, people like Donald Savoie at the University of Moncton, who were leaders and thinkers on a lot of this happening at the time. And so he had technology, he had a workforce, and he had a supportive business, academic, and social community who would help with a lot of this. And went out and marketed this and did a fantastic job bringing call centers to New Brunswick. Now, the people always give that some knocks in terms of, well, they're call center jobs. There's a bit of truth to that, but the reality is that a call center job is better than no job at all. And in fact, what happens over time is that, they adapt, they grow, they innovate, and the scale and sort of the nature of those businesses change over time. So some of them are, at a different level than others. And I think if you look at the reality now of where that's starting to come to bear, is you'll see things like the TD Finance Center, fortunately Frank McKenna again, played a role in that, but bringing that to Moncton about 2 years ago, and that's 1,000 jobs at an average salary of about $65,000 a year. So, there's a great paying jobs, sophisticated jobs, a huge investment in the community. And what's happening is, jobs are being filled by people from outside of the region because they just couldn't source the number of, they're very focused on accounting jobs, finance jobs. They just couldn't source automatically the people that they needed to in the region. So they've brought some people here. So, another issue that we have in the Maritimes, we need immigration. We need lots of immigration. And so that's helping with that. So, when you look at that, I definitely agree with Wade, is that you've got to focus on what the strengths are. And, UNB is a strength that I suspect we'll talk about this a little bit more, but yeah. UNB is a strength that the province really needs to focus on, because I think, the more that I look at and think about New Brunswick, and I stay connected a lot, I have a lot of conversations with people about what's going on there. And I think, the University of New Brunswick needs to play a bigger role in what's happening in the province.
Well, that's great insight. Another historical example of this, because you mentioned the knock on the whole call center, and that those are sort of maybe in terms of skill level lower on the spectrum. But that's sort of the historical lesson of economic development, right? So if you look at, for example, Japan in the post-war period, right? I mean, that economy was decimated. How did it start? It started with very kind of rudimentary manufacturing, right? And almost replicating American manufacturing and American products, right? Which was a sore point in international relations. But look at Japanese manufacturing today, right? I mean, so you got to start somewhere. And the lesson that I always appreciated from the Japanese experience is, what did they have? They had hardworking people, right? I mean, and they didn't, and at the time they didn't have the knowledge that they do today, right? But they had a very, very motivated workforce. And so they focused on manufacturing, and they focused on making products that they could replicate fairly easily. But then over time, they got better and better at it, to the point where they're rivaling the Americans in automotive.
Right.
So I think there's an important lesson there, and that's personally how I see the whole call center initiative during the McKenna government. I mean, you got to focus on what you have and then develop it and build from there.
Yeah. Well, look, it's a very important point about workforce and people, because at the end of the day, I think that for New Brunswick and for the Maritimes generally to sort of work their way out of some of the issues they have around demographics, around sort of lagging economies and things like that, is that they've really got to focus on the people. Look, you can bring call centers, you can bring jobs to the community. That needs to happen. But I think a long-term solution is really best achieved if you focus on, the workforce and people that are there. At the end of the day, we need to make sure that people are smarter, that they're more ambitious, they're more entrepreneurial, and it's really a lot on the education system to try to do that, and a lot of social organizations to maybe try to give some supports for families and things that may not have a lot of that natural to them. But if I were to look at it and say, you really want to change the long-term growth of the province, you've got to say, we're going to start today with kids who are 3 years old, and we're going to have a 12-year plan or a 15-year plan. And in 15 years, we're going to have everybody coming out of that stream as the most numerate, literate, entrepreneurial, technologically savvy children in the world. And there's absolutely no reason why that couldn't happen. And part of that, I think, when I think about some of the things happening at UNB in faculties around education, nursing, the technology entrepreneurship management program, law's got a role to play in that. The University of New Brunswick is a crown jewel for the province. The province obviously has got its own policy people and planners, and I'm not inside, so I don't know what's happening, but I think that a lot more could be happening where the university is basically, a think tank and a support for the province of New Brunswick to do a lot of things that should be happening. And I think the province needs to kind of jump in there and make some investments in the university, particularly for things like the technology management entrepreneurship program, the engineering school. But, we'll see what they end up doing at the end of the day.
Well, that's interesting, yeah, because there is a new government recently elected here, and they'll majority now, so they have a pretty long runway ahead of them, and hopefully they'll listen to the UNB Law podcast and get your advice. I agree with you. If you look at UNB Law just as an example, right? 2/3 of our students come from outside of New Brunswick. Okay, so we are pulling people here. I mean, when you talk about immigration, right? UNB, and I'm sure Université de Moncton and St. Thomas and all of our universities, Mount Allison, are attractive to people from outside, right? And law is a good example of that, where most of our students come from elsewhere. So we got to find a way to keep them here.
Yes.
They love it here. I mean, they feel this attachment, not just to the faculty, but to the province, to the city, to the geography, the region. So we got to find a way to keep them here. I have to say that and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, because one of the challenges that we have, and I say this at the risk of offending some of our employers, but whatever, I'll give it a shot here. A lot of the time, so most of our students, they say, come from away, and then they apply to firms in Atlantic Canada or employers in Atlantic Canada, and those students are looked upon with a little bit of skepticism, because employers say, well, you're not from here. So if we hire you, maybe you'll stay a year or two, maybe kind of like the Maritimes a little bit, but you'll go back to Toronto, you'll go back to Vancouver, or where you came from, bigger place. How do we overcome that?
Well, I mean, that is
yeah.
Yeah, that is a tough one. But look, there's no guarantee. I mean, look at me as an example. I'm as Maritimer as you can get. And, I had roots from Moncton, roots kind of in Halifax, working in the region, but ultimately I decided to leave for a variety of reasons. And there are lots of people who, are coming from bigger centers and want to live in the Atlantic Canadian region for a variety of reasons. So, those firms kind of need to take a different approach because, it doesn't follow necessarily that you've got somebody from a particular city. There's a good chance you've got that kind of stickiness with somebody if they've got roots there. But at the end of the day, I think that they've just got to focus on the people. And, we've done a pretty good job of selling UNB Law students as being phenomenal students who get a great core curriculum and are very practical. And so I think that, the school just has to continue to make that case. It is a tough one because I know I hear that from firms, but when that happens, again, I try to point to myself as an example that, it's no guarantee that you choose someone local that they're going to stay there. I mean, in fact, in Stuart McKelvey and McInnes Cooper and some of the other firms in Halifax, there were lots of people who left the region, and it happens for a variety of reasons. So, that's just it's a fallacy.
Yeah, and I think it can be an opportunity as well. I'll give you my own example. So the firm that I went to in New York is called Milbank Tweed. It's sort of one of the international law firms based in New York or headquartered in New York. And they have people from all over the world working there. Right. And they actually cultivate an alumni network. I mean, they call it an alumni network. And so, they didn't hesitate hiring me. I was from Ottawa or went to the University of Ottawa, and they sent a recruiter there. I got hired. I was never sort of questioned about my loyalty or my connection to New York. And when I told them that I was leaving, I mean, the people that I worked closest with were sad about it and whatever. But as a firm, they actually saw it as an opportunity, because they're sort of used to this. And they said, wow, Mike, that's a great opportunity. I was leaving to do clerkship. And they're like, that's a great opportunity, Mike. Stay in touch with us. You're always going to be part of our family. And that is a nice cultural thing, but it's also a strategic business move, right? Because many of the young lawyers who leave to go in-house or work for government, right, they are going to be a source of clients, and they are going to project Milbank's reputation to potential clients, right? And so to this day, I mean, I get invitations when Milbank opened its new office across the river in New Jersey. I got invited to go, and I mean, I was only there for maybe 22 months or something, right? And so I kind of feel like there's a lesson there. I mean, some people would say, okay, well, that's a New York firm or whatever, or that's Stuart McKelvey, the biggest firm in Atlantic Canada. It's not the same for smaller firms. Well, how do you get to be a big firm? Right? You get to be a big firm or a bigger firm, right? By adopting really smart business strategies and building those relationships. So that's always sort of been my thought. It sounds like we're on the same page there.
Absolutely. Look, I think it's about networking, and it's about making choices for good people. And at the end of the day, you never know. You hire someone, they might be there for their entire life. You hire someone, they might be there for 6 months. But if they're only there for 6 months and they're a good person and you've worked with them, you built a relationship, you don't know what they're going to do. They may go in-house somewhere, as they may go off and start a business. They may, be into politics or something else, and you never know what they're going to do. And you've got to build that, you have that connection with them that, may be very beneficial to your business some point down the road.
Absolutely. So I just want to ask a specific question about the role of a business lawyer and how you can best add value to a business client. So because a lot of students who go into business law, I mean, they've gotten from UNB Law certainly a really good base of knowledge in business law. We have the most required courses in business law and private law of any law school in Canada. So from a substantive knowledge point of view, our students are well prepared. But what do you think when they get out into practice, they need to focus on in terms of really adding value to clients?
Yeah, I would agree with you in terms of kind of setting aside substantive legal knowledge and so on at the start, because just assume, everybody is going to kind of be on a similar footing. I think, one of the things I found over my career is, and it's principally transactional, right? So I'm doing acquisitions, I'm doing financings. It is responsiveness, kind of tenacity. You're trying to really leading to accomplish the client's objectives. That's it at the end of the day. And the kind of work I do, and look, it's similar if you're in litigation or anything else, they want you, to be in charge, right? They want you to drive the transaction or the litigation or whatever it is to try to accomplish their objective. That's what they're hiring you for. And that's what they're, frankly, they're paying you a lot for in our industry. And so, I always try to look at it. I try to be very commercially minded. I try to be very practical. Try not to be obstructionist. If there's a legal issue here, a legal issue there, don't make mountains out of molehills. Try to find a way to work around things. And again, at the end of the day, you're there to, meet the commercial objective that your client has to try to help them, raise that money or do that acquisition or whatever it is that they've got to try to build their business. So I think, it's really, again, responsiveness, practicality, commercial mindedness. And I think, at the end of the day, you've got to try to find a way to simplify things for your client as well, because when you're involved in some of these things, they can be very complex. There can be lots going on. And they're looking to you to try to communicate to them in a simple way or in a clear way so that they can understand what issues are, what needs to be done, and try to, again, meet that objective. So, I think those are kind of the soft skills or the approaches that you need to take.
Well, that's very helpful. And so I want to continue on this theme, a little bit of advice for our students, maybe in this final segment, focus on what they should be doing in law school. So, obviously this is a challenging time, an uncertain time. We're coming out of a summer when a lot of firms delayed or canceled articling positions and summer positions. So students are feeling a little bit anxious, right, about their future. What advice would you give them about the employment market that they're entering?
Yeah, well, look, again, when I made some remarks a while back, I talked about sort of what the market was like in the late 90s. And I was very fortunate. Look, a lot of this, as you know, Mike, a lot of stuff that happens in life is around timing.
Yeah.
And, being in law school and coming out of law school when I was fortunate because the job market for associates was very robust. And now that's just not the case. It's very competitive. And if anything, it might become even more competitive. But the other flip side of the coin is that I also think a lot of things are evolving in the legal industry. And so it's not just about private practice, right? I mean, there's a lot of in-house groups that are growing quite a bit. There are more and more opportunities to be involved in early stage, kind of as young in-house counsel and startups. There are all kinds of opportunities out there. Now that doesn't, give you a lot of solace if your goal really is that I want to go into private practice at firm X, right? Because your odds and the competitive situation is just much more fierce than it ever has been. But what I would say is, that you just sort of don't give up. You keep trying and working at it. And I've got examples of students who took my course when I was teaching at UNB who have come to Toronto, wanted to come to Toronto, and their path to get there was very circuitous because they couldn't sort of get right away to the kind of place that they wanted to. If you have an article, for instance, in Toronto, it's very difficult just all of a sudden to say, 2 years out, okay, I want to go as a second year associate to firm X. But what they did was they came and they started with a small firm. They laid some roots there. They did some networking. They got to know people. They moved to a larger firm, and then they've moved to an even larger firm, and they've kind of found what they wanted to do. So, you have to just work at it. And, I was reading the other day a little bit about the story about Peloton. And, the founder of Peloton, it was talking about the financing efforts that they went through to kind of get this off the ground. And he made about 3,000 pitches to investors before he was able to get anyone to invest. And I think they invested, it was not a huge round. It was a couple $1 million, and Peloton's now multi-billion-dollar company. And but the essence of the story was all about not giving up. And that's easier said than done. Would I be able to make 3,000 pitches? I'm not sure. I think I probably would have given up well before that. But I think, again, you've got to be tenacious. Don't give up. Pursue your goals or your dreams. Do you need to maybe rethink your goals and dreams sometimes based on the situation and what's happening and kind of the reality? Yeah. I think also be opportunistic like I was in terms of, just going with the flow a little bit and see what's out there, because you never know exactly where your path is going to take you. And there are lots of opportunities out there. It just may not be that all opportunities lead to, a seven sister firm in downtown Toronto. There are lots of opportunities in rural areas where, the legal industry is grappling with issues around being able to get lawyers in rural areas to replace people who are, practitioners who are retiring in some of these communities. Again, in-house opportunities and other things like that. So I think you have to be flexible, you have to be realistic, and you just keep working away at it.
It's funny, your message to never give up and the path that some of your former students have taken reminded me of a classmate of mine at the University of Ottawa. He was actually someone I knew before I went to law school, and he did 3 years of a common law degree. And he spent the first 2 years as the president of the beer drinking club there, and had terrible, terrible grades, could not get an articling position to save his life. So the only thing he could do after graduation was do 1 year at the University of Ottawa to get his common law, and that's his civil law, and that's how we met. I was in the common law section, he was in the civil law section. And he didn't give up, he tried again. And I remember being in his apartment and seeing over 130 applications. He must have applied to every business law firm because he wanted to be in business law. Every firm in Toronto that did business law. And he had a whole system of how he was keeping track of all of these applications. He ended up getting 2 interviews and 1 offer. And he took that 1 offer, and he was with that firm, I think, for 5 or 6 years. And then he had an opportunity to go with one of their partners, the Seven Sister firm. And then he was there for many years. And now he's a general counsel of a big company in the US. Yep. And, making oodles of money, super happy, written up in all these industry magazines and all of that. And so, to me, there's an important lesson in what you're saying, and there are many examples of that. Just because he didn't have straight A's in law school doesn't mean that you can't have a brilliant career. Here we're talking about business law, obviously, and it applies certainly in that context, but I think it applies in every endeavor in life.
Absolutely.
You can't give up, you got to keep trying.
Yep. No, I think, you need to stick to it, because rarely do things work out the first time around. And, you have to deal with adversity, and you have to just keep going, because you never know where the paths are going to lead. And so, again, I think there's that aspect of not giving up. But as you note with your story with your friend, I think it's also, again, my point about being opportunistic. When you have an opportunity, take it. Even if maybe you don't know exactly what's going on, whether it's the right opportunity or not, you have to weigh it with what other opportunities you may have. But, opportunities may not come along very often, so try to make the most of them when they do.
Well, it's interesting because, we talked a lot about ambition, and business law is a very demanding field. And you're, obviously a leader in that, but you're also committed to all of these other projects. And I'm wondering how you manage all of that. Do you have any tips on time management? Because it's obviously something that has been working well for you for a long time. And I know it's something that our students struggle with.
Well, look, I think in part it depends on the approach that you take to your career. And, I've always, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, but I've always viewed law as something, well, first of all, that I'm very fortunate to have this career because it is a good career. You're compensated well. It's interesting. You meet lots of great people. I'm very, very fortunate to have had this and going to UNB enabled that. But I've always looked at the practice of law in my career as something that enables me to have the kind of life I want and to do other things. It's, for me, it's not about, the end all be all isn't practicing law. There are people who, it's the opposite. Practice law, that's all they do, they love it. I like it. But I like it. What I like about it is I like the clients. I like, some of the interesting transactions I get to do. I like, again, what it enables me to do, but it's not about that I just want to sit down and do law all day. So with that in mind, what I've tended to do is, I've really tried to focus a lot on what kind of clients do I want, what kind of relationships do I want, and so I'm kind of careful about taking on too much because I want to be able to have the bandwidth to do certain things for clients when needed. And I want to have bandwidth for other things. So I'm just a little careful about how much I do, and I'd rather do a little bit less than too much. And so, is that limiting in some ways? It is limiting in certain ways, but that's my choice for me to be able to have the kind of life that I want, right? And I've been very fortunate because I've been at two law firms at Wildeboard Lease and now DLA that enable me to do that. They just let me, I kind of have discussions with them very upfront about that, and I'm able to do what I want to do. It might mean that maybe you make less, or there are certain consequences of that. But again, if you go into that and that's what your plan is and that you want, that's just the price to pay. So that's my own perspective. So I'm just a little careful with my time sometimes. But it is very difficult when you're doing transactional work because you're at the beck and call of clients, right? So you get a call from a client at 5:30 on a Friday afternoon, and they've got something that needs to be done, a transaction that's going live on Monday morning. Like your weekend shot. There's no, you don't have an opportunity to say, oh, I was going camping this weekend, and sorry, I'm not going to be able to do that. The reality is you cancel your camping trip, and so I think
that's actually what pushed me into litigation. Because when I was a summer associate at Millbank, I did some time in their finance group and their project finance group, and then I did a little bit of time in litigation. And what's nice about litigation is all of the timelines are prescribed and you negotiate them. Whereas, my goodness, it's very hard to plan around transactional work because things pop up.
Yeah. So when it does occur, it's got to be the priority. And the second thing is, it can pop up. So it's very unpredictable as to when something can happen. You don't have predictability that, oh, client A is going to do a financing in 2 months and we're going to work this time. Like things just happen and you've got to deal with it. So it is difficult to juggle it. But what I would say is that, you have to kind of go with the highs and the lows. And when you've got downtime and you're not busy, like don't feel guilty or bad about it. Take advantage of it. Yeah. And, early on, I think sometimes it's difficult to kind of think about that and do it. But those are the times when you've got an opportunity to go do, that camping trip that you've missed, or to read the book you didn't get to, or do whatever you want. So, try to be judicious with time, think about how you prioritize things, and then take advantage of downtime when you have it. But realize, depending on the kind of practice that you have, it's going to be inconvenient to you at times.
Sure, and stressful, I imagine too, because when you get that 5:30 email, and hey, you got to spend your whole weekend, you got to maybe tell your family that maybe the plans won't work out exactly as they expected. How do you deal with that stress? Do you have any? Because this is actually a big challenge for our law students. There's a fair bit of stress and anxiety among law students. It obviously continues on into the profession. We know that mental health is a big challenge for the legal profession. And the circumstances that you describe there, that can be a source of stress, I imagine. Do you have any advice on handling stress and mental health and well-being?
Well, look, mental health is a big challenge in the legal profession, and I think people are people are much more open and willing to talk about it now, which is a very good thing. And so I think that the profession is confronting that. There's probably still lots of work to do on that. But what I would say is, trying to keep perspective. And again, the main focus, I guess, is when you've got that downtime to take advantage of that for, your rebalancing, for your recharging. If you've been working hard for the last 3-4 weekends and you have a weekend coming up now where you don't have anything, or maybe you feel like, oh, well, I should be trying to do something, but it's not that urgent, don't do it. Take that weekend to go and recharge and do whatever you need to do because you've got to look after yourself at the end of the day. If you're kind of priority number one, because if you're not healthy, physically, mentally, emotionally, then it's going to be very, very difficult for you to kind of keep up the pace that you may need to when you encounter those busy periods. So I'm not sure, I don't have like a silver bullet or magic line, but I think that it's just that to try to use the opportunities you do to look after yourself. And that's whether that's working out or reading or family or however it is, that's different for every individual, but to just take advantage of those opportunities when they come along.
Absolutely. Oh, I think that's great advice. And so we're down to the last question here, and we've covered a lot of ground and a lot of interests, and just a brilliant career that you've had, and lots of different projects and interests that you have. I'm wondering if you'd reflect a little bit on the role that your legal education played in all of that. When you think about your career, and I don't want to suggest that you're at the end of your career here. You got many, many years, brilliant years ahead of you. But as you reflect on the last 20, 25 years and all the interesting things that you've done, I'm just curious what role you think your education at UNB Law played in that.
Well, there are a couple different aspects to that. I think one is from a substantive point of view, UNB's kind of core curriculum approach was very strong, because I think students come out with a really good basic grounding in the law. There are lots of things, if you want to specialize, you can learn later on, but I think you need to have the basics, and UNB always did that very well. So I think it prepared people, it prepared me well for that. I think that aside from that and kind of some of the softer skills and things, it was really interest that was given by some of the faculty members. So again, I go back to my time with Professor Bird, and conversations I had with him, sitting having those coffees when I was doing my paper, talking about securities law, frankly, just talking about economic issues or politics or different things. That kind of interest that was given made me think about a lot of things. The social aspect of UNB was very strong. So, close friendships, and hearing from and talking to a lot of those friends. So, there's the kind of the easy answer that, look, if I hadn't gone to UNB, I wouldn't be where I'm at, because, obviously, I got my law degree, but I think that it's all of those things combined, where good, solid core curriculum, faculty that kind of motivated and inspired somewhat, and friends that created a supportive social environment that lasts to this day, has kind of, taken me through this journey to where I am now. So it's had a tremendous impact.
Wow. Well, that's wonderful to hear. And we continue on that mission. And we hope to have the same impact on our students today as a faculty had on your career, and we're extremely proud of everything that you've accomplished, and to count you as a UNB Law alum. So, Vaughn, I want to thank you very much for joining us on the UNB Law podcast. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks to everyone out there for watching, and please look for more podcasts with discussions with the amazing people who are part of our UNB Law community. Thanks again, Vaughn.
Thanks, Mike. It's been my pleasure.